Hey everybody, welcome in. Today, we are diving deep into a story that really grabbed my attention and, to be honest, kind of scared me too a little bit.
Huh.
It involves the recent death of Betsy Arakawa, wife of the very famous actor Gene Hackman. You probably know him from movies like The French Connection or Unforgiven.
Right.
Now, what makes this case so unsettling
Yeah.
is that she died from something called hantavirus pulmonary syndrome,
Yeah.
or HPS for short. It's a really rare disease.
Yeah.
I, for one, had never heard of it before.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing you might not have either.
It's not exactly a household name.
Exactly. So I've asked our expert to join me today so we can unpack this together. We're going to learn what hantavirus is, how it spreads, and most importantly, what we can do to protect ourselves.
Absolutely. It's definitely a topic that deserves more attention, especially considering the tragic circumstances surrounding Miss Arakawa's passing. Authorities found both her and Gene Hackman deceased in their New Mexico home last month. It seems Arakawa had passed away about a week prior, and sadly it was confirmed that HPS was the cause. Hackman himself was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's when they found him.
Oh, wow.
It's just a heartbreaking situation all around.
It really is. It makes you realize that even in this day and age, we still have these hidden dangers out there. So let's get right into it. What exactly is hantavirus? Should I be freaking out about this in my own house?
That's a great question. And it's understandable to be concerned. The good news is hantavirus is relatively rare, but it's definitely something to be aware of.
Okay.
It's actually a family of viruses carried by rodents. And the most common way it spreads to humans is through inhaling dust that's contaminated with their droppings, urine or saliva. Think about those dusty corners in your attic or basement. Yeah, those are prime spots for hantavirus to lurk.
Okay, so it's not like I need to worry about getting bitten by a rat on the subway or anything.
Right. While it is possible to get infected through a bite or a scratch, it's much less common.
Okay.
In North America, deer mice are the main carriers of the virus, and they tend to hang out in more rural areas.
That makes sense. Arakawa lived in New Mexico, right?
Huh?
Is that considered a high-risk area?
Absolutely. The CDC has been tracking hantavirus cases since a large outbreak back in 1993, and they found that most cases occur in the western states. New Mexico is right in the heart of that zone.
Wow.
What's fascinating, though, is that the CDC's understanding of the virus has evolved significantly since that initial outbreak. They've learned so much about its various strains, its modes of transmission, and the long-term health effects it can have.
See, that's what I love about these deep dives. We get to go beyond the headlines
Yeah,
and get into the real nitty-gritty.
exactly.
So we know that these rodents carry the virus. But how does it actually turn into this hantavirus pulmonary syndrome that Betsy Arakawa died from?
Well, after you're exposed to the virus, you might start to feel some symptoms like fatigue, fever, and muscle aches. Kind of like a bad case of the flu. It'd be easy to brush those off, right?
Right.
But then things can progress to headaches, dizziness, chills, and even abdominal issues. And here's where it gets really dangerous. If you start experiencing respiratory symptoms like coughing and shortness of breath, that's a huge red flag. It means the virus is attacking your lungs, causing them to fill with fluid.
Oh, wow. So it's almost like drowning from the inside out. That's terrifying.
It's a very serious condition.
Right.
The CDC reports that the mortality rate for HPS cases with respiratory involvement is a staggering 38%.
38%. I remember when I had pneumonia a few years back, and I was really struggling to breathe. I can't even imagine what it must be like to go through something like HPS.
It's definitely a critical situation, and it underscores the importance of early detection and treatment. But before we dive into that, I think it's important to mention that HPS isn't the only severe illness caused by hantavirus. There's another one called hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome. That primarily affects the kidneys.
Okay.
It's more common in other parts of the world, particularly China.
So this isn't just a problem in the U.S. then. This thing is all over the place.
Exactly. The National Institutes of Health estimates that there are about 150,000 cases of hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome globally each year.
Wow, that's a lot. And what's interesting to me is that different strains of hantavirus seem to cause such different illnesses. Why is that?
Well, think of it like this. Imagine you have a group of cousins who all share some similar features, but also have their own unique personalities and quirks. Hantavirus strains are kind of like that.
Okay.
They have a shared genetic backbone, but they also have these variations in their genetic code that make them target different organs
So
and cause different symptoms.
that's a great analogy. It really helps make sense of why one strain might attack the lungs, while another goes for the kidneys.
Exactly. And those genetic variations are also what makes it so challenging to develop treatments and vaccines for hantavirus.
Okay, so at this, I'm sure everyone listening is wondering the same thing I am. What can you actually do if you get hantavirus? Is there a cure?
Unfortunately, there's no specific treatment for hantavirus infections. The focus is really on managing the symptoms and providing supportive care. In severe cases like HPS, hospitalization and intensive care may be necessary.
So it's all about helping the body fight it off on its own.
Precisely. And that's why prevention is absolutely crucial when it comes to hantavirus.
That makes sense.
Mm.
But how do we actually prevent it? I mean, rodents are pretty sneaky,
Hmm.
and they always seem to be everywhere. I know I've battled mice in my apartment before. They always seem to find a way in, no matter how hard I try to seal things up.
Right.
So what are the most effective ways to keep these little guys out of our homes and workplaces?
Well, the CDC has some great recommendations. They suggest sealing up any cracks or holes in your foundation, walls and roof, especially where pipes and wires enter. Basically, you want to make it as difficult as possible for those rodents to get in.
Okay.
And don't forget about vents and chimneys. Those can be easy access points, too.
It sounds like it's almost like a game of strategy, trying to outsmart these rodents.
It kind of is. And when you're cleaning up after them, especially in areas where they might have been nesting, it's really crucial to wear gloves and a mask. You don't want to be stirring up dust, accidentally inhaling those virus particles.
Makes sense. But let's say someone is really unlucky and they do get exposed to hantavirus. Are there any early warning signs that they should be looking out for?
Yeah, the tricky thing about hantavirus is that the early symptoms can be so general. Remember, it often starts with fatigue, fever, and muscle aches, just like the flu. But here's a key difference. Hantavirus often causes some really intense muscle pain, especially in the large muscle groups, like your thighs and back.
Oh, wow. So it's not just a general achy feeling.
Yeah.
It's like serious muscle pain.
Exactly. That's a big clue that it might be something more than just a regular flu bug. And as we talked about earlier, if you start experiencing those respiratory symptoms, that's when you need to seek medical attention immediately.
So early diagnosis is key. But I'm curious, once someone is actually diagnosed with HPS, what kind of treatment do they receive? I know you mentioned there's no cure, but what can doctors do to help?
It really comes down to supportive care. Doctors will work to manage the patient's symptoms, make sure they're getting enough oxygen, fluids, pain relief. In severe cases, they might even use a ventilator to help the patient breathe. The goal is really to support the body's natural defenses and give it time to fight off the virus.
It sounds like it's a really tough battle for the body to fight. And speaking of fighting, are there any promising treatments or vaccines on the horizon?
There's definitely a lot of research going on, which is encouraging. Scientists are exploring different antiviral drugs that might be effective against hantavirus, but so far none have been a slam dunk.
So no miracle cure just yet.
Not yet, unfortunately. The challenge with developing treatments for hantavirus is that the virus itself is pretty sneaky. Remember how we talked about its segmented RNA genome?
Right.
Well, that makes it very adaptable, which means it can mutate and evolve quickly.
Ah, so it's kind of like a moving target for researchers.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why vaccine development has also been challenging. There are some promising candidates in the pipeline, but none are ready for prime time just yet. Plus, the fact that hantavirus is relatively rare makes it difficult to conduct large-scale clinical trials, which are essential for proving a vaccine's effectiveness.
So we've got this rare and potentially deadly virus
Mm-hmm.
that's tricky to treat and even harder to vaccinate against. It's kind of unsettling, to be honest. It makes you realize how vulnerable we are to these emerging diseases.
It really does. But the good news is awareness is key. The more we understand about hantavirus, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves. And while we wait for those breakthroughs in treatment and prevention, the best thing we can do is focus on minimizing our risk of exposure.
So it all comes back to prevention. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Betsy Arakawa's case again. We know she lived in New Mexico, which is a high-risk area. But are there specific things people can do in their own homes and yards to reduce their risk?
Absolutely. In addition to those general rodent-proofing tips we discussed earlier, there are a few other things you can do to make your property less attractive to the rodents.
Okay.
For example, keeping your yard clean and free of clutter will eliminate potential hiding spots.
So I guess that means no more leaving piles of leaves or firewood sitting around.
Right. And it's also a good idea to store pet food and bird seed in airtight containers and to avoid leaving trash out overnight. Basically, you want to cut off their food supply as much as possible.
Makes sense. It's all about making our homes less hospitable to these unwanted guests.
Exactly.
You know, this reminds me of something we touched on earlier, climate change. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how climate change might affect the spread of hantavirus.
That's a really important question, and it's one that scientists are actively investigating. Climate change is already having a significant impact on ecosystems around the world, and those changes can influence rodent populations. Some studies suggest that as temperatures rise and rainfall patterns shift, we might see an increase in rodent populations in certain areas, which could lead to a higher risk of hantavirus transmission.
So it's possible that climate change could actually make hantavirus more common.
It's certainly a possibility. And there's another aspect of climate change to consider: extreme weather events. Floods, droughts, and wildfires can all disrupt rodent habitats and force them to move into new areas, potentially bringing them into closer contact with humans.
Wow, I hadn't even thought about that. It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It does. And it underscores the importance of taking a holistic approach to public health, considering not only individual behaviors, but also those broader environmental factors that can influence disease transmission.
That's such a great point. It's not just about personal responsibility. It's about understanding the bigger picture and addressing those larger systemic issues.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important aspect of hantavirus prevention: public awareness. Do you think we're doing enough to educate people about this disease, especially in those high-risk
It
areas?
feels like hantavirus is one of those things that only pops up in the news when there's a tragic case like Betsy Arakawa's,
Right.
but the rest of the time it's kind of out of sight, out of mind.
That's true, and it's a real shame because awareness is so crucial for prevention.
Right.
I think we need to find more creative ways to get the word out, especially in those communities where hantavirus is most prevalent.
Right.
What if we could reach people through channels they're already using, like social media or even popular podcasts?
I love that idea. Maybe some catchy PSAs on TikTok or Instagram, or even an episode of a true crime podcast about a hantavirus case. Something that would really grab people's attention.
Yeah, definitely.
But beyond just raising awareness, what about the role of healthcare professionals? How can we make sure that they're equipped to diagnose and treat hantavirus effectively?
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle. We need to make sure healthcare providers are well versed in the symptoms of hantavirus and the latest diagnostic and treatment guidelines. Early diagnosis can be a real game changer when it comes to HPS, so doctors need to be able to recognize those early warning signs and act quickly.
You know, I remember reading in one of the articles that sometimes hantavirus is misdiagnosed as the flu or even pneumonia, especially in those early stages. That's pretty scary considering how
Yeah.
quickly things can escalate with HPS.
You're absolutely right. That's why ongoing medical education is so important. We need to keep healthcare providers informed about the latest research and best practices for managing hantavirus cases. And we also need to make sure they have access to the resources they need, like rapid diagnostic tests and the appropriate supportive care equipment.
It sounds like a multifaceted approach is needed here. We need to raise awareness in the general public, empower healthcare professionals, and invest in ongoing research to develop better treatments and vaccines. It's a big challenge, but it's definitely one worth tackling.
I completely agree, and I think it's important to remember that while hantavirus is a serious threat, it's not something we should be paralyzed by fear over.
Right.
By taking those preventive measures we talked about, staying informed, and seeking prompt medical attention if we suspect exposure, we can significantly reduce our risk.
Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely.
The more we know about hantavirus, the better prepared we are to protect ourselves and our communities. Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I know I've learned a lot. I hope our listeners have too.
It's been a pleasure to join you today and to share this important information.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there. We'll catch you on our next deep dive.